Siveza iqiniso sivuselela ukuthembeka.
Now, our first speaker today is a South African journalist, entrepreneur, and a media development trainer. She was the first female in South Africa, female editor of South Africa's Saturday Star newspaper. In 2018, after significant growth and demand for the training and mentoring offered by Fray Intermedia, which was essentially founded in 2005 and later became Fray Intermedia, the company branched off to form its sister company, Fray College, which offers a number of e-learning courses as well as in-person classes taught by Fray herself. Now, Paula Fray also serves as a public representative on the Press Council of South Africa and as a board member for Africa Check. And in 2019, she was one of the founding members of Accountability Lab South Africa and currently also serves as a board member. Her accolades are far too many to mention, but ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Paula Fray this morning. Paula, it's over to you.
Thank you very, very much for that very nice introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to really be here today and to be able to learn from everyone else, but also to share our own journey for sustainability. I want to say thank you to Namibia Media Trust, to Misa Malawi, to DW Academy, and to GIZ for supporting this conference on such a critical issue and to really create this platform for educators to be able to come together and really think about the challenges in our sector. So I want to just take a step back and say, you know, that the theme of the conference with its focus on trust and telling the truth really emphasizes how critical the need is. In fact, now more than ever, to ensure that we provide training for a cadre of journalists who are really steeped in the basics of ethical journalism and the delivery of this as a public good. So let me take a step back and just give you a little bit more detail on Fray College, because I'm talking today about the monetization of journalism education and really how we can look at creating sustainable models for journalism education in an era when the media sector itself is actually going through real crisis. So as you heard earlier on, Fray College is accredited by the Sector Education Training Authority here in South Africa to deliver full certificates in print journalism, radio journalism, television journalism, broadcast management, and then a whole range of individual unit standards around social media, around management and new venture creation. We are the first organization actually to be accredited by the Quality Council of Trade and Occupations for a new occupational certificate journalism that is coming out next year, which we're going to be piloting, which literally is a 1-year-long practical journalism certificate with a real focus on creating journalists who can really perform or function in the changing media environment. And then because we have this huge focus on new media and really creating journalists of the future, we're currently engaging with the Council for Higher Education to approve a curriculum for multi-platform storytelling, which will be at a higher qualifications framework than our current courses. And that's going to be targeted at already qualified journalists who want to ensure that they can navigate this multi-platform environment. So we deliver coaching, we deliver non-accredited training that kind of is specifically developed for media houses, but also for other communications entities. And we've been doing this since 2005, as I said earlier on, first as Fray Intermedia, and then since 2017, really as Fray College, with all of the accreditation and the processes in place. And we provide the training across Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and then in a few individual countries in South America. And again, just in terms of innovation, we're looking at short courses. We have short courses that are facilitated by experienced journalists over a few days. We have fellowships over a few months, and then we obviously have the national certificates that get delivered over a year. And we do it in person, online, via e-learning, delivered either as a timed process, so where you have to have certain outputs every week, or as a self-learning process. And both Fray Intermedia and Fray College are basically driven by this passion to change the narratives around Africa, who speaks about Africa, what they speak about Africa, and how they speak about Africa. And I've shared this background information really to highlight our entrepreneurial approach to our sustainability. Right from the beginning, we've needed to have a business model that was sustainable and that was self-sustaining. We don't have a big investor, we don't have a big financial partner, there's no big backer in the background. Our training has to sustain itself. And that is our challenge, but it's also our opportunity. Because right from the start, we needed to actually meet real needs, or we weren't going to survive. And we've also recognized that it's almost impossible for us to be a parallel entity to the media sector. We recognize that the sustainability of journalism education and the services we offer is directly linked to the sustainability of the media we serve. And so we actively participate in business development, in advocacy for media, in supporting the idea of media as a social good, because we recognize that without that recognition and without sustainable business models for media, we don't, in fact, have a business. So that's really our starting point, and our ongoing desire really is to be constantly looking and asking ourselves, how do we add value to the sector? How do we make ourselves to a degree indispensable so that the work we do can be paid for and can be supported? And so it means that Fray College is constantly making sure that we have a really good understanding and intimacy almost with the media sector in terms of what their challenges are, what the changes are, and where we need to go. So let's consider some of the long-standing media trends, right, that have been developed and identified over the years by organizations like WA and IFRA, because these trends really inform how journalism is taught and how we can make journalism education sustainable. And for me, the one thing that we are I'm constantly looking at, because it means that we can't be complacent, is the fact that the way we consume news, the way our audiences consume news has changed, and it will continue to change. So there's this ongoing process of, are we where our audiences are? Are we training journalists to meet the needs of the audiences today, not the audiences in March 2019 when the pandemic was declared, not the audiences 5 years ago when our curriculum was developed, not the audience 10 years ago when we might have been in the newsroom for the last time. We want to know, are we being responsive to the way news is being consumed today? Because we need newsrooms that are, quite frankly, comfortable with change. And so we have a huge focus actually on change management, not only helping journalists to understand how the industry is changing, right? What this era of disruption means for journalism, but also that we have journalists who are comfortable with change. The second really big trend is that, and we saw this during the pandemic, audiences are not reliant on one or two media outlets only. They're not reliant on a newspaper that gets dropped off at their house or that they buy on a street corner. They can really consume, they have so many more choices. They can consume news anywhere. And because they can consume and they can get news from many.
But really, I'm intrigued by this question of looking at innovation and how do we like redirect? Is it more shorter courses? Is it more continuous professional development? Is it the issue of pre-service? Is it in-service training? So just, I'm trying to ask the question of what is an enabling environment for journalism education look like that has to be sustainable?
Yeah, no, very good question there, Patrick. We've unfortunately lost Paula in the meantime, but I think Zoe is on and Zoe will take that question.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to see you again online. Hopefully, Paula will be able to join us shortly. We did, as the Namibia Media Trust, we did a skills needs assessment in 2019 because we are also looking to develop a multi-pronged training solution for journalism training in Namibia, and possibly also to share with our partners elsewhere in the region. And what we've come to learn is that, as Paula said, any kind of solution must be very, very closely linked to the needs of the media fraternity. But what we have realized is that, and I mean, this is a response from media managers, senior editors, journalists themselves, that there is a need to just go back to the basics. And whatever we do in terms of innovation thereafter must be linked to those fundamentals of journalism. And I think that Paula also stresses that a lot in her training. But I see, Paula, that you are back. Do you want to take over from here?
Yes, I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about the innovation that we need to be thinking of, but I mean, it must be embedded in the basics, right? If you look, so for example, at the trends that we're seeing a lot of change, but we're also seeing that increasingly that if we want to monetize our media, then we really have to base it around trust. People will pay for media they trust. So integrity is our currency. If there's no integrity, if people can't trust our media, if we are unable to verify information, we really lose the battle for a sustainable media. And so for us as educators, I think the idea of focusing on things like verification, ethical journalism is really important. When you look, for example, at what happened since the start of the pandemic, the Reuters Institute's digital news research really gives you some insight into the changes wrought by the pandemic on global media. We know, for example, that to a degree trust in media has grown, but it has grown for trusted brands. So we've got increased consumption, and where we have brands that already had trust for their audiences, we've seen those brands being able to leverage the changes. And there've been quite some dramatic changes. I mean, print newspapers that already was suffering before the pandemic really kind of globally went down from around 40% of news consumption to around 32%. We saw an increase in television consumption. We saw an acceleration online, and that accelerated shift to digital is something that we as the media sector really need to be thinking about, and thinking about whether we have journalists actually that can cope and that can actually work in this new environment. It is impossible. I'm sitting in the Magaliesburg here in South Africa, and we're training journalists, financial journalists this week, and it's really impossible for anyone these days to say, I'm a print journalist, or I'm a TV journalist, or I'm a radio journalist. You absolutely have to be a multi-platform storyteller. And then for me, the big thing about the pandemic is the focus and the concerns that people have expressed around misinformation and disinformation. I think that that's one of the big challenges for us as trainers, but also for newsroom managers to make sure that they have a cohort of journalists who really are able to tell the difference between misinformation and real information. And then, of course, if we're going to monetize our online news, then we need to make sure that we're offering, in fact, our audiences something of value. For me, the big issue also is how do we tell our journalism in an era when breaking news is digital, when people get their news on their cell phone long before they get it on radio, on TV, or in the newspaper, and where social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter, are really critical for news consumption. And also, we need to be realistic. And I was so pleased when I saw that TikTok was on the conference program, because what we find globally, for example, is that 1 out of 4 under 35s consume information and news on TikTok, and that very often journalists themselves are being eclipsed by influencers on TikTok, on Snapchat, and on Instagram. And this is critical when we look at information and disinformation. And so one of the things that Reuters said, for example, around the changes since the pandemic, is that we're seeing more and more quality journalism go behind paywalls, right? And as print and digital born publishers both begin to turn to subscription, membership, and donations to reduce their reliance on advertising, we're finding that a lot of the advertising online is still going to Google and Facebook. So real challenges for the media that we serve as educators. I want to look a little bit at this, at the situation in South Africa, because I think that when we drill down, when we drill deeper into the impact at national level, we can begin to see the challenges that the media that we serve are actually facing. So the South African National Editors Forum actually commissioned a COVID-19 impact on journalism report. And it noted that, you know, if the media were kind of holding on to this ever-reducing pie of advertising revenue before the pandemic was declared, then the pandemic really kind of effectively just smashed that. And SANEF's report basically said that the COVID pandemic had effectively taken away the pie, and that what was left is a news industry that was just desperately looking for new ways to sustain itself, while audiences continue to ask for credible but free news. And the impact in South Africa was absolutely devastating. I mean, we had, within the first few days, in fact, of the lockdowns, we had up to 400 journalistic jobs lost in those initial phases. We had closure of print publications, widespread retrenchment, journalists being asked to take pay cuts of up to 45%, and a number of journalists actually being sent home without pay until the situation could be furloughed. And if that situation is true of newsrooms and of media houses, then it's almost impossible not for it to have an impact on media educators. What we already know is that journalism's already had a difficult few decades, right? But from an education point of view, whether you're a college like Fray College, or whether you're a university, whether you're offering degrees or master's degrees, we already know that journalism's qualifications, marketability actually is being questioned, right? So, I mean, if you see a sector where there's just such widespread retrenchments, why would you want to go and get a degree in journalism? Enrollment at journalism school is being challenged, and we're finding that media houses are beginning to see training as a luxury rather than a necessity. And so very often when we're doing outreach, we're having to convince people why they should be training rather than convince them that they should be using us for their training. The other impact, though, with the pandemic, right, is that declining public trust in media also has a real impact on the perceptions of the viability of media. And so we saw a little bit with the former American president that there was a bit of a resurgence in a belief to hold the powerful to account. And so, you know, a resurgence in terms of the power of the media. But we're finding that, that people are not paying as much attention as before. And we as a sector, both as a media sector, but as the education sector supporting media, really need to be thinking about how we support a call for and a recognition of media, of journalism as a public good. I think what we're also finding is that the cost of unsubsidized training, right, means that many students who go to university to get a journalism degree end up being heavily indebted, only to be hired into a low-paying job in the newsroom, and then we lose those journalists to higher-paying jobs in government or in corporate public relations, really starting this negative cycle of people not want to invest in journalists because they're expecting them to leave anyway. And then I think that when we're looking at global calls and global arguments of sustaining media as a public good, what is missing is the inclusion of journalism training to support and to ensure this public good. And so I'm going to argue a little bit that we as educators in the sector must not be complacent, that as organizations begin to think about lobbying for financial sustainability of media and for the financial support of media as a public good, that we need to make sure that education and training is included in that process. And it's important because you will see that where the public perception of the media is low, where there are lower levels of media trust, there's a lower demand for the support for media sustainability. When you have well-trained journalists performing ethical journalism as a public good, you have higher level of trust, and you have higher support for media sustainability. When Reuters did their research earlier this year, and they spoke to respondents around trust, there were large numbers of the respondents who simply didn't know or care about media sustainability, financial sustainability. And my concern is, and I think Reuters has highlighted this, that if the media don't think that, if the public don't feel like media sustainability is a critical issue, then those holding the purse strings, whether they're funders or governments, etc., are unlikely to consider the need for media sustainability as well. So I want you to think, I'm just raise very, very quickly some of the recommendations around media sustainability, because I want you to put onto our agenda as educators the real need to make sure that education is included in that process. So in South Africa, the Satchel report looking at ethical journalism in South Africa really recommended that, that the media explore taxation incentives, allocation of public funds, and we know how public funds are very often wielded against media by governments who want to keep media in line. We want to look also at levies on online advertising revenue that is currently being diverted to organizations like Facebook and Google, and lots of other opportunities for media, for sustainable media opportunities. So let's just drill down a little bit deeper into what SANEP was calling for. So SANEP has a couple of tools that it's looking at, and one of them is the establishment of a media sustainability fund. And the mission of such a fund would be to support the development, sustainability, and the independence of public interest media organizations, right? And I think the key here is public interest news. That really, in pursuance of the right to freedom of expression and democratic principles, that a fund like this would really support public interest news. There's a lot of debate about how you define it, who would be perceived as public interest news, and whether or not such a fund would really privilege big media houses. But my concern today is for us to make sure that when we are looking at these media sustainability practices, that we also make sure that the idea of training is included in the entities that get supported by a fund. Or, for example, SANEP also recognizes the potential to support the media by promoting access to public interest news websites, by substantially reducing data costs, and advocating for zero rating of public interest news websites and content. SANEC is also saying that we need to be able to foster competition in the digital economy by making and by engaging with organizations like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. And I'm agreeing, and I'm saying that a lot of the opportunities on these platforms for training also need to be harnessed. And then, of course, there's tax relief consideration, state support schemes, right? The introduction of online taxes, income tax. One of the recommendations for South Africa is potentially South Africa's Income Tax Act, allowing for media entities to have tax deductions for people who subscribe to community and local media. My challenge is that if we're looking for sustainable training opportunities, we need to make sure that we put training onto this agenda as well, and really look at opportunities for education to be supported in pursuit of public interest journalism. We must ensure that educators are at the table when these issues are being discussed, and that the act of training is seen as critical to the production of journalism as a public good. I really want to advocate for that, and I really feel that this forum is a really good place to really come together and to make sure that we're putting those kinds of demands also on the table. I think we must also advocate for a commitment from media houses to ongoing training so that journalists are steeped in ethical journalism practices, and that we must lobby for the extension of the benefits to training bodies to ensure that we continue to attract the best and the brightest to the journalism sector, right? So for me, though, there's a big challenge. And I think the big challenge is that if we want to claim a space at the table, then we really must continue to ensure that we add value to the journalism process. And I'm going to be hard on ourselves and a little bit reflective here, but because if we're talking about the monetization of journalism education, then we really need to ask ourselves, how are we constantly challenging the work we do and the value we add to the sector? I think that the lag in responsive curriculum development means that we are often servicing a traditional model of journalism when the act of journalism is being done in non-traditional spaces. And I think that TikTok is a really good example of that, right? I mean, if you look at some of the journalistic uses for TikTok and how far traditional media houses are often away from being able to harness that, then I think that as training institutions, we need to be more responsive to the here and the now, but also to be able to anticipate future directions. For me, the basics of journalism remain critical in this era of misinformation and disinformation. But the practice of journalism must recognize the changing ways that audiences engage with news and information. And we must make sure that the media workers that we work with, not just the journalists, but the editors, the sub-editors, the photographers, the developers, the graphic artists, the technical staff, the camera persons, the newsroom managers, that all media workers are actually future fit, that they recognize the changing media environment and they're able to serve this public good on the platforms where our audiences are. But just like the media we serve, we as trainers also compete on a global stage. And so I'm often asking the team that I work with, why would people want to pay for training with Fray College if you can get similar online training for free with a massive open online course? I mean, any of you who've done a MOOC know that there are really amazing opportunities out there for training. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we offer students and journalists on the African continent that they cannot get elsewhere? What value do we ask? And so for us, really, it's the investment we make to ensure practical impact in the final product. That means, as I was saying earlier on, we're constantly researching and trying to keep abreast of journalism trends so that we can anticipate where journalism is going what skills will be needed. Maybe we're not using them now, but they will be needed. And then investing in skills audits and research that identifies sector needs, and then developing products from that research that is unique and responsive to local needs and demands. Very often in our e-learning training programs, we then also have to invest time and effort to help the students navigate this online learning. We have to create virtual online campuses, and we need to put in place a whole lot of additional steps that maybe an international organization wouldn't think is necessary, but we know that if we don't want a huge dropout rate, if we want to reduce attrition, that we constantly have to be supporting our learners to make sure that they stay engaged as much as possible. And then for us, it's a matter of being able to show value back to the media houses or the funder or the corporate sponsor to show. So we're constantly investing in impact assessments that can show the return on investment. I think sometimes, very often, we don't see the need for ROI, for return on investment analysis. We think, we serve the sector, years our work, we've done it, we've finished. But for us, it's very often beyond the newsroom. Have we convinced the chief financial officer, the CEO of the media house, that what we've done has added value? When we look at how we can actually create training that pays for itself, I think it's really important to have an intimate knowledge of the sector so that we can be responsive to its needs. And so for us, this really means this constant review of new platforms, of new applications, of new platforms, of new applications to anticipate which of these might have longevity for storytelling. And sometimes what we find is a new application might come in and then it disappears and then it comes back. If you look at gamification, for example, it came in a while back. People kind of lost interest. The push, the acceleration online means more people are beginning to look at gamification again. If you look at virtual reality, it was big. It kind of dropped away. It's big again. It's getting to be big again. So not all applications live long beyond the initial launch excitement. But as storytellers, I think we need to be really responsive to the consumption needs of our audiences. And so when these things come back, we need to be ready for that. I think we also need to consider how technical engagements can actually enhance our storytelling, right? I mean, I was talking earlier about gamification, virtual reality, augmented reality. I think we need to be looking at this acceleration online to really think about that. We find, for example, that research shows that the majority of time spent online is spent on games. So, when we talk about the average person spends 2 hours, 48 minutes a day online, they're not there reading news. They're there playing Candy Crush, etc. And so it's almost, how do you harness that desire for storytelling? Right? How do you use gamification for storytelling? One of our guest speakers at the training that we're doing at the moment was at the Financial Times, and they're actually about to do huge investment in gamification. So it's really interesting to see how these things come back. For example, at Fray College, in our e-learning, in order to enhance engagement in our learning programs, we've added gamification. And so, yes, you can read, yes, you can watch videos, yes, you can do quizzes, but you can also play games, right, that really kind of reinforce the learning, but also help increase engagement. I think as trainers, we also need to ask ourselves if we are, in fact, following the trends for storytelling formats. So, for example, right, I mean, if news breaks on social media, then by the time it gets onto radio, TV, or into a newspaper or on a website as long-form journalism, we need to add value. And that value often is in the form of solutions journalism, explainer journalism, multi-platform storytelling, use of audio, use of video, use of infographics, data journalism, etc. And so we really need to ask ourselves, are we actually creating opportunities for our learners to be able to tell the stories in different formats, because certainly their audiences want to consume the story in different formats. I mean, podcasting, it has a surprisingly strong following on the continent, but more importantly, there's incredible innovation in the way we are using WhatsApp, for example, which is the primary social media platform on the continent. We're finding WhatsApp magazines, WhatsApp podcasts or audiograms. And so as trainers, we need to make sure that we're actually keeping abreast of that. And I think the other thing is that the legacy format stories are increasingly more complex, right? Investigative journalism, people, there is actually an appetite for the long form story. And so we must support our journalists, I think, with critical thinking skills and ethical journalism decision making. I said early on that we often train for traditional journalism when journalism is happening in non-traditional spaces. And I think that if we as training entities want to remain relevant and support innovation, then change management and even entrepreneurial journalism is key. We need to recognize that it's not just the traditional newspaper where these stories are told. It's also the startup being told by someone with no journalistic background, but actually has a strong audience and has a desire to tell our stories. So I think those are the formats for journalism, but I also think that we need to think about how we deliver our training. Newsrooms have shrunk. Even when you're offering free training, news managers don't have the space to let people go. And so asking news editor to spare participants for training is often unrealistic, right? I mean, there's no room to take somebody out of the newsroom. And so I think we need to rethink our delivery in terms of the platforms we use, the timing, but also the outputs. A week out of a newsroom is a luxury. And the reality is that short courses, unless they're really targeted and very specific, often don't really deliver the kind of impact that gets people coming back. So I think that we must consider delivering training workshops in different ways to minimize time away from the newsroom, and where possible, incorporate opportunities for storytelling. I think the field trip, I think the short course delivered over a couple of days, I think the after hour engagement, all of these are things that we need to be thinking about. For us, the impact of our training is what leads to repeat business. Most of our work comes from word of mouth, and that means that we sometimes have to guide our clients away from their traditional way of training, sometimes to a longer fellowship or to a different way of engagement. We are also finding ourselves delivering what used to be in-house training, the day of a journalist learning by sitting next to somebody, coaching them through the writing of the story. Very often you don't have that level of seniority in a newsroom. And so we're finding ourselves doing a lot more things like basic coaching and support for young interns. And the success or the effectiveness of such training really is an understanding of the organization's editorial code, who their audience is and how to deliver it. It can't be a one size fits all anymore. We have many challenges. How do you, for example, monetize critical skills thinking, critical thinking skills, or ethical decision-making skills? We regard fact-checking, verification, and ethics as key skills that must be included in all our training. And where we can, we try and have a case study-based approach that really allows people to be able to engage with the decision-making in a very practical way. We're also exploring new ways of teaching journalism, including whether we can use storytelling tools to teach journalism. So I want to just wrap up by talking about our 4 sustainability pillars. Firstly, we really believe that our training must add real value in order for it to be sustainable. If we are expecting newsrooms to let go of journalists in already overstretched newsrooms, then they must return to that newsroom with immediate gains, whether it is a possible story, whether it's increased networks because of the sources we've actually exposed them to, whether it's access to the latest trends, or whether it's a skill that they can actually implement immediately. The second thing is that our product development, if we're talking about monetizing journalism education, then our product development needs to be evidence-based. We must serve a real need, and we need to be able to show newsroom managers that need, which means that we're in a constant iterative process of research and development that is backed by monitoring and evaluation. We develop a training, we implement it, we review it, what worked, what didn't work, we rethink it, we improve it. It's this constant cycle. Even if we have a successful course, we recognize that every year the case studies need to be updated. We need to ensure that we have better examples, etc. And so innovation is key. We want to embed innovation in our training modules, but we also want to embed innovation in the newsrooms that we work with. The third thing we do is we measure success not by the output, but by the product and its impact in the media. We're constantly looking at what stories came out, how were the stories developed, what happened with the stories, how did audiences engage, so that the media can see the impact of the training and not simply say that the impact was somebody attended a workshop. The impact is somebody attended a workshop, a story that had real impact on audiences was the result. And then our fourth pillar really is a partnership approach. We feel that the need for training across the continent is too great to be competitive. We partner with other training institutions, we partner with academic institutions, we partner with funders who support us, and we partner with the media houses who we support. We feel that the opportunities to improve journalism just get harnessed much better when we're working with others in the sector than competing with others in the sector. And so let me thank you, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
Thank you so much, Paula. You've said quite a mouthful, and everything you've said was so exciting. I don't even know where to start with questions. But there was a comment in the chat box that I just want to read to you quickly. Chloe McGrath said, integrity is our currency. She was quoting you. She said, I love that. People will pay for the media they trust. And that is really the overall theme for this conference. My question is, Paula, is how do we restore this trust? Because I think we do recognize that there is a level of trust that has been lost. So how do we restore the trust? And more importantly, how do we maintain it? And I want to tie that first question into what you've just said before you ended off. You were talking about entrepreneurial journalism. I'd like for you to unpack what that is, or ideally what entrepreneurial journalism would entail. Yet also does this form of journalism, because these are not professional journalists, so does this form of journalism not dilute real or what we consider real or true journalism? And how do we then monitor dis and misinformation with this kind of journalism, and simultaneously trying to restore trust, because trust is solidified by telling the truth.
So let me start with the issue of trust, right? I mean, so the challenge with trust, and I know from the discussions that this is going to be coming up over and over again, is that it really is something that gets built up over a period of time, right? I mean, readers, audiences engage with us. They recognize that our news is verified, it's trustworthy. They recognize that they can come back to us and actually get the kind of information that they need, and that they can use that information to make informed decisions and be active citizens. It takes one piece of misinformation that is shared by us. I mean, I'm thinking of a couple of examples where I have had on my social media timelines information shared by journalists that a quick reverse picture search would have shown that that is not a vaccination rash. That is a picture that's been on the internet for months, for years. And, the journalists just needed to do a quick reverse picture search to have seen that that was misinformation and not to share it. But also, a leading television house interviewing someone on the vaccine who is not an expert, but is very, very loud on social media. All of those acts actually undermine our journalism and undermine public trust in us. But there's also external undermining of public trust in us. People who wield the term fake news as a weapon against the media, people who deliberately target media saying, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you don't report this, you have an agenda, etc. So, I mean, I'm sure this will come up again, but really, really quickly, I think we need to be absolutely vigilant about our integrity and the perceptions of our integrity, in the sense that when people challenge our integrity, I think we need to stand up for it. The kind of thing that happens on social media where someone will take a news story and share it and say, you won't see this in mainstream media. And of course, it's a story from media. And I think that what happens is that I come from an era of journalism where media was so powerful that we never ever felt like you needed to justify yourself. But I think that we are in an era of transparency. The media need to be engaged in a constant conversation with their audiences. When people say we spread misinformation, we should provide evidence that we don't. When people say we don't report certain things, we should provide evidence that we have. And we should do it over and over again. We should stand up for our integrity. We should stand up for the audiences who believe in us, to trust us. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to make sure that our journalists can, in fact, differentiate between real information and misinformation and disinformation. We cannot just act as if that is something intrinsic and that it's a natural skill. We need to make sure that in our newsrooms, we take that seriously and that we're actually making sure that our journalists are able to do that. And then I think we need to be fastidious about applying the press code. And very often there's a laxity around applying press codes because people want to be first with the news, or they want to have the better, sexier story. And I think that really when you're building trust, it needs to start from the top. It needs to start with a real culture within a media organization that says we do not compromise on the quality of our ethical journalism. That's just a no-go. So it's not a quick fix, unfortunately, Nina. It is something that we really need to be thinking of it's about the organizational culture, it's about the organizational practices, and it's where we invest our funding. So I think that's the first thing. When I speak about journapreneurship or entrepreneurial journalism, I think I want to recognize that the day of the big media house is not necessarily over, but that we're beginning to see opportunities for more players in the market. And rather than disregard the new entrants in the market, I think we need to make sure that we're actually engaging and making sure that we're bringing them into formal structures around the press code, etc. But I personally believe that sustainable business models for media is a press freedom issue. that if we want a plurality of media, that we need to really begin to identify how to build sustainable business models for media. And so when we look at entrepreneurial journalism, when we look at I mean, I think we need to welcome them for bringing in new voices, for giving more communities an opportunity to be served, rather than kind of say, those aren't real journalists, right? Because they haven't come in via a structured media entity. And so, so that's the one thing. But then there are real journalists who just don't know how to make their businesses sustainable. And I think that as much as we have to offer training on the 5 W's and the H and on storytelling, we absolutely have to offer training on the business side of journalism. Because if we don't have well-managed businesses, we won't have media in the long run. You'll have 1 or 2 people really kind of dominating the public discourse, and very little space for smaller media entities. And so that's my drive for journalpreneurship, is that we give people opportunities.
Paula, sorry about that. McLean, can you just mute there for us? Thank you so much. Please continue.
Yeah, no. So for me, actually, building journalpreneurship, entrepreneurial journalism is all about really supporting a plurality of voices, so that you've actually got more people in the sector telling the stories of their communities.
Nina, I think this is a great time to do a follow-up question in terms of just, I think a very engaging and a very necessary conversation. But you know, I find sometimes that in media houses, we tend to be very inward looking, you know, so when if SWOT analysis, we'll talk about our strengths and our weaknesses, but let's talk about the external environment, and particularly in a huge paradigm shift in the external environment that we live, which is we've switched from an information age to an intelligence age. Klaus Schwab writes about this, you know, the founder of World Economic Forum. So looking at the external kind of positionality of particularly journalism, education, and what you're talking about, monetizing the business side of it, what are, in terms of the threats and the opportunities, rather not just the strengths and the weaknesses, but particularly when it comes to the intelligence age, and you know, obviously talking about innovation, where does that position journalism?
Well, I mean, you know, some of the things that we were raising earlier on, right? I mean, if you look at, well, first of all, I mean, I think it's both an opportunity and a threat that the practice of journalism is just open to so many different people, and that when you are looking at opportunities for storytelling, and you're looking at opportunities, you both have there's a greater range of storytellers, that you don't need to be working in a formal media house in order to have a following, to have an audience, or to be able to tell stories. If you look at the successes, for example, on some platforms, you've got, I mean, a really interesting thing, the Reuters research shows that there is a generational gap. Young people want their information to come with a position. They want journalism to take a stand on climate change, on poverty, on inequality. And so you're finding platforms like YouTube really serving young people, because very often the YouTubers are producing news with an opinion. On the other hand, you have older generations who want news that has a perception of neutrality. I say a perception of neutrality, right? Because we all know that we bring to the news our own socialization and our own background and our own inherent biases. And while we need to be aware of them in order to make sure that we're kind of bringing news as objectively as possible, that's not entirely 100% possible. So I think that is a huge opportunity. I think mainstream media, if it doesn't look at the way it tells its stories, might actually lose this generation, who will then never move into mainstream media spaces for their news, but might continue to be YouTubers, social media news consumers, etc. So I think that's one issue that we want to deal with. But the technical disruption is ongoing. And very often the people that do really well in the new media formats are the people who have really recognized and been able to utilize the technology in its new formats. And so what you've got is mainstream media really struggling with change management in order to bring these new technologies into our storytelling routines. And you've got startups who don't have any of that knowledge really telling that story. So I mean, I think that's one of our, Patrick, some of the challenges that we have, but also incredible opportunities. I mean, I am so excited for the possibilities of young people to tell new stories, to tell those stories differently, and to tell them on different applications. So I think that we're still in a very exciting part and period of journalism. As educators in this room, we really need to ask ourselves if we're being responsive to those needs, or are we simply following what we've always done? I mean, I want to say that a lot of people like myself come out of a mainstream, a legacy media tradition. Our journalism training was, I mean, my degree was in the 80s, right? If I want to be responsive to the needs of today, I've got to work as hard as everyone else to make sure I'm keeping up with the technology, I'm keeping up with the new ways of telling stories, but most importantly, I'm keeping up with the demands of audiences.
So just quickly, what are the tools that we need to do that? Because we know with digitization, it's not just the skill that you need as a journalist, but it is tools of speaking to media houses. What tools do they need to have in terms of testing readiness and making sure an enabling environment? Talk to us about that.
So I would say, Patrick, that, I mean, I very often say it doesn't matter what platform you use, right? Because the platforms change. I mean, my big exciting platform at the moment is Twitter Spaces, right? I mean, I'm seeing incredible conversations happening on Twitter Spaces, etc. I'm not as worried about the individual platforms or the individual apps. I think the biggest skill you can have in this day and age is a comfort with change, right? Is a comfort with change, is an openness with change, a willingness for change, and an absolute comfort with change. If we can teach people not to be so resistant to change, if we can teach people to be constantly looking for the new, if we can teach people that it's okay to change every 3 months, that's fine. The ultimate goal is, what is the best way to tell the story? It's the best way to tell the story that matters. Be comfortable with change. Maria Ressa is on our media management course, and she's one of our case studies. And she tells our participants, right, that one of her jobs is to go around and try the new technologies. And she comes from CNN. So to take 3 years to change the operating platform that they would use in an organization like CNN. But at Rappler, they're changing every 6 weeks. They're so comfortable with change that if there's a new way to tell a story, there's no meeting, there's no long discussion, there's no 3-month engagement. It's like, let's try it, let's do it. Did it work? It worked, keep it. It didn't work, kick it out, try something new. Comfort with change. If there's one skill that everyone needs, it's comfort with change.
Well, I think you're talking to me when you're saying that. Just practical experience, you know, being in television, you get on set, you're not used to having to edit your video. You're not used to, you know, upload this. You're also not used fundamentally to the level of engagement that comes with, you know, changing your environments in which you know, it was more one directional, but now it becomes bi-directional. So if there are any questions out for Paula, maybe some of the comments of, I think, the very exciting conversation that's happening, please raise your hand, talk to us in the chat box, and we will then obviously continue engaging Paula, particularly in terms of positionality. But let's, Paula, what is the intersection between formal, kind of this formal idea of education and the very much informality that's arising, particularly if we have to promote this concept of lifelong learning when it comes to journalism?
It's a really good question. And so, you know, I think there are huge advantages in formal education, right? Because it's benchmarked, the outcomes are very clear. And of course, I mean, for us, having the certificate that is recognized is also important. But I think there's also that need for informal training that is a lot quicker, a lot more flexible. So for example, you know, some of these skills that we're talking about, how do you tell stories on TikTok? yes, podcasting is something worth doing a formal training session on, but what about the audiogram? What about the WhatsApp podcast? What are the differences there? So I think that a combination of the formal structured education is important, but then also this idea of really having the quick turnaround. I am a coach who is coached. I am a trainer who is trained. I'm always learning new things. I'm always finding out how to do different things. I'm a user of MOOCs. I'm also a dropper out of MOOCs, but we won't talk about that one, right? I once signed up for Python training, and I just thought, okay, this might be a bridge too far. But I mean, I think that yes, that culture of lifelong learning is so critical in newsrooms, and the only way that you actually get journalists to do that is if you create spaces in your newsrooms to do it. Something as simple as, right, when you have a story that really works, can you have a brown bag lunch that really sort of says what worked, what didn't work, why did the story work, what are the things you do? And it doesn't even need to be your story or your newsroom story. It can be a story that everyone is talking about. We're sometimes quite competitive, but I think that we need to reach across platforms and actually begin to talk about different ways of storytelling. I would strongly urge that if you're a print journalist, right, or you're a print newsroom, to invite a television newsroom, a television journalist to come and talk about visual storytelling, invite a radio journalist to talk about the power of audio, because we really need to begin to think of not the platform or the medium, but the story, right? So that you're thinking about how is the story get told. There's a lot of research that shows that people consume stories across platform, that they want to see it, they want to hear it, they want to read it, right? And so we need to be responsive to that.
I think very well done, very good presentation. I think what's very clear is if we want things that we haven't had, we have to do things that we haven't done. And your answer really talks about unlearning a lot of the kind of hegemonic approaches that dictate how we tell the story, and realize kind of the multiplicity, the plurality that comes with this. Paula, I have learned a lot. If you could see, I'm in goosebumps every time I learn. I'm learning. I think it's very insightful, and it's the great way to, I think, find comfort in change. Any closing remarks before we move on to our next session?
A very, very quick thing to say, I am, despite the challenges, because we are in a really challenging time, I think this is also a really exciting time. I want to see new ways of storytelling. I think Africa is already driving the way we tell stories on WhatsApp, by the way. I mean, make no mistake, there is innovation happening across this continent and in different regions. So I think we're already seeing that. But I do want to say to you, we don't have to tell the stories that we've always told, and we don't have to tell them in the way we've always told them. I would challenge everyone to rethink our storytelling techniques and to tell more people's stories in more exciting and engaging ways. And I'll leave it with that.
Ms. Paula Fray, CEO of Fray College, we understand now why you have that title. Very succinct, very insightful, and I think very practical. A lot of the times, we get in very principled discussions, but you talk to us about the process as well, and you've then spoken to us about some of the practices that we can endure. So thank you very much, Ms. Paula Fray, for that. Again, ladies and gentlemen, let's flick a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you.
Siveza iqiniso, sivuselela ukuthembeka.